Hi there, it's Ben Housel here, and here in this tutorial we're going to look at how we make this simple header and footer in Apple Motion that we can then use in Final Cut Pro. This header and footer has editable text, so when we click on it, we can select any of the text elements that we want, modify them, change the type, type in our text in any of these different locations. We can change the color of the text, and we've also got it set up so we can change things like the color of the background so it matches your brand. I've also included a link below so you can download this template and install it. It's free to use, but of course if you want to go ahead and learn how to do this, then jump in and we'll look at how to create this in Apple Motion so that you can use this title template in Final Cut Pro with editable text. This is a great project to work on if you're just looking at getting started with Apple Motion and creating generators. We'll talk about creating shapes, how video works behind the clip, and also how we can work with things like rectangle mask to mask off areas of images. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we begin, we will need Final Cut Pro and Apple Motion open. And essentially, we're going to generate the title template in Apple Motion, and then as we generate different parts of it, we'll look at how that works in Final Cut Pro. We'll talk about the size, the resolution, and things like frame rate as well, so that you can have a template that will work for the size and format that you're working with. So we'll jump into Apple Motion first of all here, and we're going to go to File and New. And once we're in here, we're going to create a new blank template, and it's going to be a Final Cut title template that we're going to work with. Now you can see across on the right hand side, my default template is set to Broadcast HD, which is not what I want. I actually want it to be a square format for Instagram. So when we apply it to an Instagram video, it works perfectly. So we're going to click here and come to Custom. And so here, the maximum size right at the moment, and this will probably change, so you might want to look on Instagram if you're looking a little while after this video has been published. But at the moment, the size for that Instagram video, square video, will be 1080 pixels by 1080. We won't have any field order, and we're working for the web, so we don't need any interlacing on there, which is what the field order is. And we will have a square pixel aspect ratio, so make sure you set that. And then the frame rate, I'm setting that to my camera's frame rate because that's where most of my footage is coming from, but you will want to match the footage that you're working with, whether it be PAL, which would be 25 frames per second, or a different frame rate if you've set your camera to work in 24 frames per second or a different frame rate. But I'm going to stick to 29.97 just to match the camera's frame rate. And then I'm going to select the duration here, and I'm going to make the duration of this 1 minute. So to type in 1 minute here, I'm just going to type in 1 period, and that's 1 minute, the period, send it to seconds, so effectively 0 seconds and then 0 frames. And then if I press tab, I'll now jump out of there and you can see it's set to 1 minute and 2 frames. We're going to be able to shorten that and lengthen that once we get that on the timeline. Once this is all set up, we can click open. And so now you can see on the right hand side we have our clip, which still looks 16:9, but if we come to our zoom level up here, you can see that it's set to 100% rather than to fit. And if we set it to fit, then you can see essentially we have that square video. So what we have here will kind of instantly work in Final Cut Pro with this default text that is set up at the bottom here. So I'm going to go to File and Save, and I'm going to save a new template. We'll call this Instagram header footer, and I'm going to click on my category for titles, and I'm going to put it into Ben's titles. If you don't have a category for your own titles yet, then you can drop it into new category, and it's a good idea to kind of collect different things in a single location. And then we're not adding it to any themes or anything like that. So I'm going to hit publish. And so now, as soon as I've done that, if I come to Final Cut Pro, what I need to do here is set up a timeline that's square so it will actually match those Instagram settings. So we're going to go to File, New, and Project. I've already set up a library for this particular exercise. So you'll need to set up a library and then set up a project with these settings, and we'll call this Instagram test. And once that's set up, we don't need to worry about the starting time code, but what we do need to worry about is the custom video resolution. So again, we're going to set this to 1080 by 1080 and 29.97, so those frame rates matched, and we'll check drop frame here. And then once these settings are set, we can click OK. So now that we have that timeline set up, we can drop a video down onto the timeline, and I'm going to drop down the audio for this one. And I'm going to use a shortcut that I often use, which is Shift and Z, which is going to zoom me to the entire timeline. And you can see here I've got around 12 seconds of video of this wave being caught and ridden. And we're now going to come into our titles generators at the top left, where we can see the titles, the default titles, and then also my titles. And we'll grab the Instagram header and footer that we created, and we can drag that down onto the timeline. So now you can see we can select the text, we can modify it, and we have the beginnings of our title template for our Instagram setup that we're working on. So for now, we're going to leave this, and we're going to come back to motion, and we're going to add in that backdrop that we can see in the background. So what we can see here is that we've got the text, we've got the title background, and because we're dropping the video into Final Cut Pro, it's kind of automatically resizing it. So it's letterboxing it using the fit options that you have normally set up by default under the video options. So if we have fit set up here, it's going to letterbox that video, which is quite useful for this particular example. If we uncheck fit and change it to none, then it will fill that frame. So essentially now the video is not letterbox, and we have the text overlaying that. But that's something we can set up in Final Cut Pro. So I'm going to leave this at fit, and we'll come back to our motion project. And we're going to come down to the middle of our screen, just above the project timeline, and click the rectangle tool. So what this is going to allow us to do is to create a new rectangle. So essentially, I want to create a rectangle that is going to fill this entire space, but then have a letterbox in the middle here. So once I have this selected, I'm going to draw on a rectangle just roughly in here, but then I'm going to come to my inspector up at the top left, and I'm going to set the geometry of this rectangle so it fills that space precisely. So we'll come to geometry, and at the moment the size is set to 995.8 by 991.5. We want that to be exactly 1080 by 1080, so it fills that space. And then we also have under the properties the position of that shape, which we'll set to 0 and 0. So now we know that that shape is right in the middle of our screen and filling it. So we're not going to have any random lines at the edge which might show up or pop up from time to time. The next thing we're going to do is add a mask to our layer. So I'm going to come to my rectangle mask tool just above the timeline here on the right hand side, and I'm going to drag out a rectangle mask. And what we're going to do is we're going to invert this. So there's a couple of different approaches to this. We can come to our mask controls, and we've got options for the size here as well. We want the width to be 1080, but we want the height to actually match that 16:9 proportions, but with that reduced size of video. So I'm going to hold down my command key and tap space, and we can do a little bit of math here. And essentially, we want to divide 1080 by 16, so the width of that video, and then we want to multiply that by 9, which will be the height of the video, so 607.5 pixels. So actually, just to be safe, I'm going to make this letterbox shape a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make this 600 pixels tall, which means it's going to be a little bit smaller than the video that we put behind it. So if I click away here, I'm going to type in 600 here, and now we're going to invert this mask. So basically, by inverting the mask, the color will appear at the top and the bottom and reveal the video in the background. Now the text that we have at the bottom here is actually hidden because it's in the layer below our rectangle. So we can grab that layer and then just drag it up above our rectangle. And once we've saved that, if we come back to Final Cut Pro, it will keep the original version of that template on the timeline. So it's not going to change things dynamically. But if we delete this and then come back to our new Instagram header and footer and drag it down, you'll see that now we have that header and footer matching perfectly with the video behind it, and we have the option to type the text there. So we have the nuts and bolts of our header and footer there. So the next step is to look at how we can change the color of this background dynamically so that we can modify it in Final Cut Pro rather than having to go back to motion all the time. So if we come to our generator options here for our title, you can see there's no published parameters. So it's really simple to do in Apple Motion. If we come to Motion and select the rectangle in the layers at the bottom here on the timeline, the project timeline, we can come to the style of our shape, and under our fill color, if we come right across the right hand side here, we can click on this little downward pointing arrow and press publish. So now again, if we come to File and Save, or Command and S, probably use the shortcut from now on, then we'll come back to Final Cut Pro, delete our Instagram header and footer from the timeline, and drag down the new header and footer. And what you'll see now is that we have the fill color available so that we can edit it in Final Cut Pro. So we have red, green, and blue sliders. We can modify those, or we can use the color picker that pops up here to pick out any color that we want to use. And actually, one thing you can see is the video is not completely filling up the background there. So I notice this sometimes in Motion, the title background, if we select it here, if you go to the scale, if you see those lines there, just go to the scale and make it 105%. And we're looking at the Final Cut image placeholder, which will be the video as well. And now if we do that, it will actually scale it up a little bit. We can save that, again, delete it, drop that back down to the timeline. And now we can see we've got that crisply in there. So you can see the video when I turn the header and footer off by tapping V, the video in the background is just increasing a touch, and that's stopping any lines popping up around the edge of that video. Now we could publish that as well so that we can tweak it in the published parameters, but we'll leave that as is at the moment. A 5% increase in the video when we're reducing it in size already shouldn't be a problem. So now we'll come back to Apple Motion and we can begin to work on the type. So I like to select things often in my layers in Motion, just because then it's a little easier to actually select things here. So we're going to make 3 type layers, but before I do that, I'm going to set the basic type format so I don't have to go through and change the fonts for everything. So at the moment we're using Baskerville. I'm actually going to come down here and we will use Verdana for our font. So if we scroll all the way down, we'll find Verdana. And one of the reasons I'm using that is just because it's going to be available to everyone. So Verdana and bold, and we will center the type so it appears right in the middle there. And I can also drop this down a little bit. Once we've done that, we can modify any type that we have in Final Cut Pro. So we don't need to publish any type parameters here. They'll already be available to edit in Final Cut Pro with this type text layer. And now one thing I will do here is set it to all caps, and I'm going to change the all cap size to 100% so we have everything in full caps. And I will leave that as is for the moment. You can tweak the size and location of your type once you're in Final Cut Pro. So now if I hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, I can drag up and duplicate that layer. So we'll call this type bottom, and then we'll move this next type layer up to the top, and I'm just making sure it snaps to the middle there. Add one type layer there, and then we'll call this type top header 01. And I'm going to right click here and duplicate that text again, and we will call this type top header 2, and I'll move this down so it makes a bit more sense in terms of the ordering of that. So type top header 2 will be just below type top header 1. So now we've got our type header 1. We can modify the type here if we want to, so we can increase the size of it. We could have a different typeface for the next one down, so we'll come to regular and we'll increase the size of that. I'll just nudge this up just a little bit. And so you can see now we've got 2 text headers. We can also modify the color of one of these, so we'll change this initial type color under appearance to a yellow. So I'm just going to pick it from down here, or you can come in and use your RGB sliders or your color picker up here if you want to. We'll change that to yellow, and then we'll close that. Again, we don't need to publish the text color, it's available in Final Cut Pro already by default. And then for the text at the bottom here, we could add, if we wanted to, another rectangle. So we'll grab a rectangle here and draw that on somewhere around here. And I'll select for the fill color there, that same yellow. We'll close this. And now I just need to drop this down below that bottom type. So for the text at the bottom, we can position that roughly in the center here, and we'll make the color of that type black, and we'll change the font face to regular as well. So now if we save this, you can see if we come back to Final Cut Pro and drop on the new version of our Instagram header and footer, then we have a header and footer. We can change the color in the background to any color that we want. We can modify that depending on what we're looking for. And we can change the hue or pick out a color that we're using elsewhere in our video. So it's a nice, easy way to create a template. There's a couple of other things we can do as well, and one of those is to actually add in a little bit of a gradient fill in the background here. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this, but in order to keep the color editable, I've found that actually creating a copy of this rectangle layer. Okay, so I've made a straight copy of that by holding down the Alt key, or you can right click on your layer to duplicate it, and then changing the fill mode to gradient. For the gradient, we're going to have simple black at one end and white at the other end. So I'm modifying under my shape the style of that shape, and I'm going to change my gradient from linear to radial, so it radiates out from the center. And actually I need to swap around my black and my white. And so just so it's a little easier to modify the gradient, here I'm going to turn off the mask for this gradient layer. And you can see, once I've done that, I can see the location of my gradient, and I can come down to the X and Y position here and modify how that is positioned. So I'm going to just move that. So I'll just keep modifying these numbers until I kind of get what I want. Then I'm going to use the darken feature so that it darkens that layer in the background, which will get rid of the white, and we'll just leave a kind of vignette of the black there. So once we've positioned the start X and Y and the end X and Y for our gradient, we can turn the rectangle mask back on, and we can come to the properties of my layer, and we can use the blend mode of darken to darken the background, and now you can see we get this nice vignette on the background, and I can change the opacity so that it isn't quite as intense in the background. And actually I'm going to use multiply in the background there. It seems to create a little less intense color change in the background. So I need to come back to my shape and my rectangle copy and just modify the start and end here. So I'm going to turn the rectangle mask back on, and you may find that you need to tweak this a little more as you go through. So I want the vignette to be like a little bit lighter around the edges. So I'm going to actually change this so that it's a little bit of a lighter grey, so the vignette is not quite so intense. So we're just getting a little bit of darkening towards the edge rather than that intense darkening. So once that's done, I will change the rectangle in the background as well, the color of that, just so we can see how this works with a different color. So you can see we get this nice gradient on some of those lighter colors, just to give a little more texture to the background of your project. So if we go to File and Save, or Command and S, then we can come back to Final Cut Pro. You can see now, once I drop this on, we have that nice gradient in the background there. We can select our type. And we can select the different type boxes here. And when we're modifying type in Final Cut Pro, as I mentioned, we have all the options to change the size, color, and so on and so forth. So we can modify our text and position and everything really easily in Final Cut Pro. So we have a good template to start with, and then we can go ahead and modify size and stuff like that. Now there's a couple of other things that you might want to add into your layers in Apple Motion. We could put a logo in there just by importing a transparent PNG, and we can also add some animation there. If you do add animation, then as you change the duration of that 1 minute generator, the animation will change in speed. So that's something to keep in mind. But what you can see here now, if we save this again in Final Cut Pro, once we move away from the text editing, then we can see it play through that whole video. And we simply need to zoom out and trim the end of that 1 minute piece to match the duration of our video. So that's how to make a simple header and footer in Final Cut Pro that will just drop onto any clip that you have that you want to upload to Instagram. And it's nice for the thumbnails. So I have seen some people where they will create the short header and footer just at the beginning here. So you could do that and then jump into the main part of your video that perhaps will fill the screen after the video started. So you can basically move from a header and footer, which means that Instagram will recognize the thumbnail, and then you can jump from that into the full video at the end. And obviously we can add any transitions that we want to onto there, so that we can fade this out and time it perfectly with what we're editing on our timeline. So hopefully that's useful. If you have any questions about Final Cut Pro, Apple Motion, then don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.